It may at first seem strange to claim that death is a taboo topic. After all, death is in an awful lot of modern culture. Even putting aside Game of Thrones, which treats death somewhat unusually, and may well be a good case study for a later video, the idea that there are people dying or dead or about to die isn't controversial. But I would argue that modern culture tends to champion a sense of death as contingent. By this I mean a sense of death that can be outrun or outmaneuvered. In action films from James Bond to Star Trek, the possibility that the central characters might die is always there, but somehow or another, they always manage to escape. The rules that might apply to anyone in normal, non-fictionalized life are bent so that our characters don't die. The fact that 007 can jump from a high window without a scratch is a sign of how we bend the rules in fiction around dying, so that it doesn't hold a power of absolutivity. The contingency of death doesn't just allow for the continuation of a narrative, though of course it is partly that, but I think also it reflects how we as a culture tend to perceive death, how it becomes taboo, and hence denied. Let's back up a little here and talk about the idea first introduced by sociologist Ernst Becker, known as the denial of death. Becker's essential idea is that we, as humans, are in tension with ourselves. On the one hand, we have a sense of death as an end to our existence, as mortal dread. On the other hand, we can't keep focused on death all day, every day, otherwise we wouldn't be able to do anything at all. He writes that the fear of death must be present behind all our normal functioning in order for the organism to be armed towards self-preservation. But the fear of death cannot be present constantly in one's mental functioning, else the organism could not function. But the result is what he called the denial of death. The latter wins over the former, and so we deny death the power it simultaneously demands. We deny it so we do not dread it. This is by no means to say that Becker was without his critics, and many people have pointed out ways that modern culture does not, in the way ascribed, deny death. Look at hospitals or people with illness. It's estimated, for instance, that the funeral industry is worth annually around £1 billion and $20 billion. Though it may be useful if I limit the scope of my claim, I do not believe that modernity as a whole denies death, but rather our expression of death in culture seems to. This also hasn't foregone popular culture entirely either. Part of the brilliance of TV shows like Scrubs is their willingness to subvert comedy and, at least partially, present death as an unavoidable, apparent reality. JD makes the important point that we fight death every single day. We can't let it know that we're afraid of it.
We fight death for a living every single day. We can't let it know we're afraid of it or it'll kick our ass.
Here, just as culture looks at death as straight on as it might, we see an insight into a wider sociological perspective. It is JD's pretending that we are not afraid of death because we conceive of it as avoidable. The death presented is no longer death, and so death itself is denied. It becomes a representative phenomena without any real power. Though of course the opposite is actually true. Although a fictionalized universe will represent death as impotent, and in doing so negate our existential terror of it, death itself doesn't go anywhere. It is against this background that I want to paint Philip Larkin's poem, Aubade. Aubade, published in 1997, quickly sets a somber tone and a slow and steady pacing, which becomes the backdrop for what Becker calls the fear of death, that which is required for its denial. Capitalizing on a style of language that is relatively simple, Larkin draws the reader into a deep and emotional experience of how he perceives death. Listen to Larkin himself read his definition of death from within the poem.
But at the total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always. Not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon. Nothing more terrible, nothing more true.
The beats of this line play masterfully. The emphasis of the N sound is alone as a hard beat, except for the last syllable, truth. The result is to echo nothing and truth. These two notions are then what form the basis of the poem's dread. In the following stanza, we see the same idea re-sketched into more humanized terms.
That this is what we fear. No sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell, nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anaesthetic from which none come round.
The matter-of-fact rhythm to no touch or taste or smell helps to project a sense of inevitability, and hence truth to Larkin's vision. The rhymes between link and think, and alliteration between love and link, juxtaposes the human need for sociality against the background of a true and absolute nothingness. This is then all spun around the use of human-centered verbs, driving home how it is as people that touch and taste and smell, often together, linking and loving, will lose everything. This poem does not hold back. Death is unavoidably present, but when we zoom out of these definitions, we see how Larkin places them in the context of the whole piece. When we do so, I believe that we can see a response to the denial of death. At both the start and the end of the poem, we get a short contextualization.
Till then, I see what's really always there, unresting death, a whole day nearer now.
And then, at the end of the poem,
slowly light strengthens, and the room takes shape. It stands, plain as a wardrobe, what we know, have always known, know that we can't escape, yet can't accept. One side will have to go.
Discussion of the absolutivity of death, how we, at some point, are going to die, is done in a moment of a fleeting flash of our own mortality. The ability and depth that Larkin aims to create is done in those moments between waking at 4 at soundless dark and when that moment of morning when slowly light strengthens. This is the title of the poem, Aubade. Opposite to a serenade, it is a song for the morning, a moment before day has started, but before night has ended, a moment that sits on the margins, neither one nor the other. Then, in what are quite possibly two of my favourite metaphors in English literature, Larkin writes,
Meanwhile, telephones crouch, getting ready to ring in locked-up offices, and all the uncaring, intricate, rented world begins to rouse. The sky is white as clay with no sun. Work has to be done. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house.
In these last few lines, and through these two metaphors, we have a sense of the world returning to a state of denial. We, like Becker, would have us believe, and modern culture finds reassuring, to go about our lives, not worrying about the weeks, or the days, or the hours that we might have left to live. The first metaphor is of the telephones crouching in offices. Telephones for Larkin are these symbols of the day-to-day distraction. They crouch, waiting to busy us, so that we can retreat from our unresting death. The second is in the complete brilliance of Larkin's last line. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house, he writes. The seemingly bizarre simile between postmen and doctors asks us why Larkin has put both of these professions together. But here, in this last line, we find the crux of how Larkin sees us deny death. Cesar Chatterjee writes about this line, both postmen and doctors are emblems of that mundane world which sustains itself by contributing to the ordinary world's pattern of death-defying intricacy. Death-defying sustenance is found in how we busy ourselves. Doctors and postmen are very busy people. They have work which must be done, and I doubt go from house to house, consumed by an immobilizing dread of death. Yet, doctors more than postmen have, as I have mentioned, a connection to death that is almost undeniable. Both Scrubs and Philip Larkin recognise that. So underneath the death-defying intricacy, the busyness of everyday life, lies the unrecognised, unseen reality of death. Larkin moves us on from Becker's mere denial of death, and in turn away from a sense of death being entirely taboo. The fairly simple idea that because we dread death we refuse to see it is addressed by Larkin with a much more nuanced hand. Of course we refuse to see it, Larkin claims. Most of the time we have work to be done, yet the denial of death is not a complete idea. It fails to take into account the liminal moments when suddenly we see clearly that we will die, those moments that consume us when in the margins of our day-to-day lives we can't help but be overcome by what is really always there. These are not taboo moments full of shame, but moments when we see truth painfully clearly. Larkin found in the moments before dawn this truth about being human, that sometimes death catches our eye, and for a few moments we are overpowered by our own mortality. But then, importantly, not because we are ashamed of our own mortality, but because it is the only adequate response to our own mortality, we go back to work.